chapter, we will develop the tools that we need in order to assess whether a market, price, and quantity is economically efficient. Theoretical microeconomists, like my former professor Leonid Hurwitz, have examined conditions under which the market mechanism results in economic efficiency. The conclusion is that in a market environment with no monopoly power, no externalities, and no public goods, that the market mechanism results in an efficient allocation of resources. We can use consumer and producer surplus analysis in order to verify this. Consumer surplus is the difference between what you are willing to pay for a good minus what you actually have to pay. So if you're willing to pay $1,000 for the new iPhone and the market price is $800, you enjoy a consumer surplus of $200. You would have been willing to pay $200 more than you were required to pay. Willingness to pay provides the underpinnings for a market demand curve. In this example, our market for used economics textbook consists of 5 potential buyers. Alicia is willing to pay $59 for the textbook. Brad is willing to pay $45. Claudia, $35. Darren is willing to pay $25. And Edwina is willing to pay $10 for the textbook. On this information, we can graph our demand curve for used textbooks that shows the relationship between the price of the textbook and the quantity demanded. So when the price is above $59, the quantity demanded is 0 because there's no one willing to pay more than $59 for the textbook. When the price goes down to $59, the quantity demanded is 1 because Alicia purchases the textbook. When the price is $45, Brad is also willing to buy the book, so the quantity demanded is 2. Similarly, when the price decreases to $25, Darren is willing to buy the book, and the total quantity demanded is 4. And when the price is $10 or below, Edwina buys the book, and the total quantity demanded is 5. So using this willingness to pay data, we can derive the market demand curve for used textbooks, assuming there are 5 consumers in this market. And the area under this demand curve gives us the total in this particular market. If we take the total willingness to pay minus what each consumer has to pay based on a market price of $30, we can calculate the consumer surplus for each individual. Alicia is willing to pay $59 minus the $30 price gives us a $29 consumer surplus for Alicia. Similarly, Brad is willing to pay $45, pays $30, and has a $15 consumer surplus. Okay. Claudia is willing to pay $35, pays $30, has a consumer surplus of $5. In this market, if the price of the book is $30, the quantity demanded is going to be 3 books, which is going to result in the total consumer surplus, which is the area under the demand curve, which is above the price point. When we add the consumer surplus for each individual together, when the price is $30, the total consumer surplus in our market is $49. Similarly, we can derive a market demand curve for one individual consumer or a representative consumer. And here we see George is willing to pay $35 for the first shirt, $25 for a second shirt, and $15 for a third shirt. If we graph this relationship, we'll see that similarly we have price of shirt on the vertical axis, quantity demanded on the horizontal axis. If the price is above $35, the quantity demanded is 0. When the price is $35 or below, the quantity demanded is 1 shirt. Then when the price goes down to $25, George is willing to buy a second shirt. So when the price is $25 or below, the quantity demanded is 2 shirts. Then when the price drops to $15, George is willing to buy a third shirt. So if we have the demand curve for our representative consumer, it would look like this. And we could calculate the consumer surplus. In this case, if the price of the shirt is $28, George is going to purchase 1 shirt. His consumer surplus is going to be the $35 that he's willing to pay minus the $28 that he actually pays, which is going to give us $7 in consumer surplus. He's not going to buy a second shirt because his willingness to pay is less than $28 for the second shirt. And when we look at the demand curve for a representative consumer, we can later on devise pricing strategies that are going to allow us to maximize the revenue that we can derive from our representative consumer. When there are more potential consumers in the market, our demand curve becomes one that is both smooth and continuous. And here we have our linear demand curve. In this demand curve, the total willingness to pay is the area under the demand curve over to the quantity that's actually being consumed. So our total willingness to pay is the area under the demand curve to a quantity of 90 units. Our consumer surplus is the difference between the total willingness to pay minus what the consumers in this market actually pay. So the total willingness to pay is the area under the demand curve up to this price point minus what they actually pay. So our consumer surplus then, which gives us the area that's above the $20 price point, and the graphical representation is a triangle. So the area of the triangle, when we calculate it, is 1/2 the base times the height. So that in this example, the base is 90, the height is 80 minus 20. So if we take 1/2 the base times the height, we get a consumer surplus total that's equal to 2,700. If there is a drop in the market price, we see that consumer surplus is going to increase. Here the market price goes from $30 down to $20. And you can see in this example that consumer surplus is going to increase. It increases partly because the people that were buying the textbook before received the textbook at a lower price. And consumer surplus increases because now we have another consumer, it's the textbook. So we can see that when you lower the market price, willingness to pay stayed the same, but the actual amount paid decreases, and total consumer surplus is going to go up. This slide for the computer market reiterates this point. When there's a drop in price, additional consumers are willing to buy the product, and they receive consumer surplus, and existing consumers that purchased the product previously continue to buy the product, but at the lower price it expands their consumer surplus. So the increase in consumer surplus due to a price drop, it's partly the lower price for people that bought the product before, plus the consumer surplus that's realized by the additional consumers that now purchase the product. Same market for used economics textbooks has 5 potential sellers. Andrew has an opportunity cost for his textbook. Opportunity cost meaning the value in its next best alternative to Andrew is only $5. So when the price of the book is $5, Andrew is going to be willing to sell his textbook. At a price below that, he's not willing to sell his textbook. Donna has an opportunity cost of $15 for her textbook. Carlos, his opportunity cost is $25. Betty's is $35. Engelbert has an opportunity cost of $45. And if we plot these opportunity costs, what we derive is the market supply curve for textbooks, assuming that there are only 5 potential sellers in this market. So when the price gets to $5, Andrew is willing to sell his textbook. So at a price of $5, the quantity supplied is going to be 1 textbook. When the price gets to $15, Donna is going to be willing to supply her textbook also, and the total quantity supplied is going to be 2 textbooks. When the price gets to $25, Carlos is going to be willing to sell his textbook so that the total quantity supplied is 3 textbooks. When the price reaches $35, Betty is willing to sell her textbook. The quantity supplied is 4. When the price reaches $45, Engelbert is willing to sell his textbook, so the quantity supplied is 5. And when the price is above $45, the quantity supplied is still 5 because there are no additional sellers in this particular market. So what we derive here is the market supply curve for textbooks, and the area under that supply curve is the opportunity cost of each seller in this particular market. Surplus then is the difference between the market price for the textbook minus the price at which the individual seller is willing to sell the product, which is their opportunity cost. Here we calculate the producer surplus in this market, assuming that the market price of the textbook is $30. At this price, Andrew is willing to sell the textbook for $5, but is able to sell it for $30. So his producer surplus is 30 minus 5, or $25. Betty's producer surplus is 30 minus 15, or $15. Carlos's producer surplus is 30 minus 25, or $5. When we add more potential sellers to our market, we're going to get a supply curve that's both smooth and continuous, as this linear supply curve shows. The total producer surplus is going to be the area that's above the supply curve up to the price line. So this pink shaded area is going to be producer surplus in our market for wheat. And we can show that producer surplus is going to increase when the price of wheat increases. The reason for this is because the initial sellers are getting $2 per bushel more for wheat, and at the higher price draws in additional sellers. So we can see that the quantity supplied increases. So this is the consumer surplus that accrues to the original sellers, and when we add new sellers, we can add their producer surplus. So the total increase in producer surplus is given by these shaded areas. When we include both the demand and supply curves in our market for used textbooks, we can calculate both consumer and producer surplus. And consumer surplus is the area under the demand curve down to the price point. In this case, the equilibrium price is consumer surplus. Producer surplus is the area above the supply curve up to the price line. So the pink shaded triangle is our producer surplus. And total surplus then is the sum of consumer plus producer surplus. So if you practice your algebra here, you can see that consumer surplus is 1/2 the height times the base, which is 1/2 of 12, or 6, times the base of 120, which gives you 720. Producer surplus is 1/2 the height times the base. So the base is 120. The height is 10 minus 4 is 6. 1/2 of that is 3 times 120, which is equal to 360. Add them together, you get 1,080. Why is it that the price and quantity that maximizes total surplus, the sum of producer plus consumer surplus, can be viewed as the efficient price and quantity? Get this intuitively and show that given that price and quantity, it's not possible to reallocate consumption among different consumers, or reallocate sales among different sellers, or change the quantity that's being exchanged. And the subsequent slides are going to illustrate this intuitively. The market allocates consumption of our textbook to consumers that are willing to pay the most. The woman on the left is willing to pay $35 for the textbook. The gentleman on the right is only willing to pay $25. So if the market price is $30, the woman on the left is able to purchase the textbook, but the gentleman on the right is not. Allocating the textbook to the gentleman on the right would reduce consumer surplus and result in less efficiency. Similarly, the market allocates sales to the most efficient producers or sellers. A seller who's willing to take $25 for the textbook is going to be able to sell that textbook before someone who would not be willing to take less than $35. A change in allocation between the two would reduce producer surplus. This slide shows that if you reduce the quantity transacted from the equilibrium quantity back to Q1, there's going to be a loss in consumer plus producer surplus. Because at this quantity, buyers are willing to pay $35 for the book, sellers are willing to take $25 for the book. So there should be an exchange here that would increase either producer or consumer surplus. Similarly, if you're at this quantity, buyers are willing to pay more than sellers are willing to take for the book. So there should be a transaction until you reach the point where buyers and sellers' price is exactly the same. So there's going to be a loss of either consumer or producer surplus that's equal to this area of this triangle, which is sometimes called your dead weight loss. It's a loss that results from a quantity that's not the most efficient quantity. Similarly, in this diagram, if the quantity was Q2, here buyers are only willing to pay $25 for the book, while sellers require $35 in order to cover their opportunity costs. So here you've gone too far, and this area represents the loss in consumer plus producer surplus that results from having sales that are higher than the equilibrium quantity. So if you follow this logic through, the quantity that maximizes the sum of producer plus consumer surplus is going to be the equilibrium quantity. Competitive markets are usually efficient because consumption is allocated to the buyers who are willing to pay the most. Sales are allocated to sellers who have the lowest opportunity cost. And each transaction in the market is mutually beneficial or mutually favorable because the consumer is willing to pay at least that much for the product or more, and the producer is willing to take at least that much or possibly less. So every transaction is one that's mutually favorable to both the buyer and seller.